Hey Collective, it's Alan. Welcome back to Altruistic Channel. Today's video is going to be a follow-up to the series of questions I've been kind of directing at Elon Musk and other brilliant minds out there. And it actually centers around the topic of the Garden of Shadows and the idea that we seem to share in common in the enlightened community, where we are starting to question if we actually live in a simulated experience, or better yet, a virtual reality of some kind. And so in order to kind of bring everybody more into the conversation, I thought I would explore some of the ways that light affects what we perceive and how we experience the world around us. And in particular, I wanted us to imagine, if we will, walking down the street in the middle of the night and coming across a light post and looking up at the light and catching the fact that our eyes and the lens from which we see the light itself cast the halo around it, and how it is reminiscent of what you might see if you point a camera in the direction of a light fixture like the sun or whatnot. Something you can see in certain shots of landscapes when you are doing a panoramic view and you see the line of sight, if you will, of the sun and how it creates little circles on film. And I wanted us to focus our attention on the fact that when we believe ourselves to be enlightened in the Garden of Shadows, which we call the Earth Academy, we tend to notice that the more present we are and the more enlightened we are, the more rings we see appear around that source of light. And so I wondered if many of you have ever pondered the reality of the simulated experience from the standpoint of what the light actually conveys, and if it actually serves as a projective device. And what I mean by that is, if you've ever been to a movie theater, have you ever noticed that the projector shoots the images through light, and that it's against some sort of white backdrop or some sort of blank canvas? And how, when we're looking at a street light at night, we start to question if what the light is projecting is actually there, or if we, through our eye, is connecting the assumption of what should be there and creating the environment in which we are. And the reason I say that is because, let's say that you are standing by yourself. What you encounter as the experience that you are having in the simulation is reflective of your personal place in life, right? If you are someone who is fearless, you will probably point your attention towards focusing your energy or your attention to the way that things look at night and the beauty that it possesses in that particular fashion. But let's say you're standing next to someone else who is a little bit more timid or a little bit more worried about the world around them and lives in a space of fear, and how they might focus their attention, even though looking at the same projected image, from the lens of what they should be cautious of and what they should be aware of in their surroundings. And it made me start to really look at the way that we as a collective are kind of encountering this experience of the division between Earth and the simulated experience that we seem to all be sharing now, where we're seemingly going down two different paths. One where the slumberers continue down the road of making bad decisions and kind of being in a fear-mongering state and being very, very receptive to fear tactics, where there's a group of people who are now venturing off almost onto their own, where they are kind of doing a pilgrimage into the new uncharted territory, where they are embracing the shadow nature to this garden we live in, and are actually trying to venture into the unknown knowingly, because they understand that when they actually make their progression, that they actually are able to, in an empowered, enlightened state, create what they are experiencing as a brand new clean slate. And that is what a reset is. And the reason I brought this up towards Elon Musk is because, as you guys know, I've had a series of questions directed at him, and one of the things that I realized in this scenario was that it depends on the lens and the way that you view the world, right? And so what you experience from what the overall light fixture is showing is basically up to you. And I started to really look at the whole universe in the way of divine union and divine cosmos, and how there seems to be a structure and order to the matrix. And I wondered if Mr. Musk would probably agree that one of the rarest things you can find on this planet is another person who sees the world in the same lens as you do, and are willing to experience the world in a fearless state, or in the same way that you do, and how rare that makes the dynamic between the two parties, whether friendship, love, or business, let's say. And so as I was thinking about this entire thing, I was realizing that in the simulated theory that we are sharing as a collective at this time, we find ourselves pondering whether or not we are actually manifesting the outcomes of what we actually experience in each setting, right? If we look at the world as a stage, and we realize that the light source, whether it's the sun or sunlight or a street light or whatnot, that there's always a form of light over our heads. And does that affect what we perceive? Because if you look at the double exposure phenomena that you would be experiencing when looking up at a light post, you realize that your optical illusion, the lens of your eye, may be playing a part in the relay. Is it possible then that in the simulated experience in a virtual reality, each of us is wearing a set of goggles that is specific to something bigger than us, something higher up? And the reason I say that is because let's revisit this whole walking in the street at night. Notice that if you take a higher perspective from the same scenario, that the optical illusion that we experience as people alters, and instead of it being a 3D experience, an immersive experience, you almost end up looking down at something as though an anthill, and suddenly you change dimensions in your perspective, in which your experience seems to be more focused on the trivial nature of life, because you're looking at it from above the light. So you're now seeing it at a more miniature stage. And does that affect the way that you experience the same thing that you may have had a negative reaction to on the ground level? So to further explore the idea of the simulated experience, let's now take ourselves into the desert. After all, we are in the Garden of Shadows, essentially a theory that states that we are in God's imagination, if you will, God, Allah, the divine matrix, the universe, whatever, I call it the great architect, and that we are basically souls that are experiencing a virtual reality experience where the soul is taking accountability for its own actions as it progresses, and there are costs to everything that we do within the game of life. And so now let's take ourselves and we put ourselves in the desert, which is the reference to the religious aspect of Moses being in the desert, lost and finding his way. And let's put ourselves in there, only this time instead of being by ourselves, let's go in pairs. So let's say that Mr. Musk and I am walking in a desert because of the fact that the car broke down or whatnot, and we have no way of knowing which direction to go. What would be the biggest indication for which direction we should traverse if we were in the pitch black? Well, wouldn't we search for the light, right? And that seems to be an all-encompassing theme, whether spiritually, scientifically, or just practically. We would search for whatever light source is nearest, and because we would assume that there is life there or help of some kind. But isn't the adage like a moth to a flame burned by the fire? So let's say that we're now walking towards a light source of some kind off in the distance. We don't know if it's safe or not, because in the daylight we probably wouldn't go to a very secluded, isolated home in the middle of a desert. I mean, have you not seen The Hills Have Eyes? Like, we would immediately be like, okay, probably not the best idea. Why don't we go down the road and see if a car passes? But in a dark shadow nature, we would allow the fear to dictate that it's probably safer for us to seek the light out and take our chances than we probably would have if we were in the sunlit environment. So Mr. Musk and I are walking in a desert, and we can't see anything because there's no moon, right? Because the moon is a reflective surface of the sun. So the moon's not out, it's a new moon, so there's nothing there, just starlight. So all we can see is darkness upon darkness, different shades of shadow, and we start to make our way through. Now, because of the fact that there's no light source in the simulation experience, the theory would be that we ourselves are creating what we're encountering as we walk, based on assumptions that the game, the virtual reality or the simulation, would be telling us that would be at our feet. So wouldn't we then act, whether warranted or not, in a manner that changed the way that we walk in order to not trip on something, rocks, brush, dry brush, or cactus? Now the question then would be, are they actually there, or are we just assuming they're there because of the lack of light and the fact that our eye can't focus without the light on what we're seeing? Kind of a metaphor for the life experience in general and what a soul encompasses when it's doing the journey of life, right? Okay, everybody's with me so far. If not, at the very least, Elon Musk, you're with me, right? Okay. So we're walking. Now, the question that I pose, and the reason I'm bringing this up as a form of conversation for the virtual reality simulation theory, is the fact that as we walk, Both of us are conscious of just where we're stepping. We're not sure what's there. Our eyes can't adjust. It's almost like an autofocus. We can't get it right. So we're assuming there's stuff there. So our focus is primarily on that, and that we're going towards whatever light source that is, taking the chance that it's safe, but it's better than being in the dark. Fear allowing to be the predominant focal point at that point, driving us forward. So as we walk, suddenly our eyes finally get comfortable with the fact that we are in a desert, and so our eyes relax a bit and we're able to focus a bit better and see the shadow differentials between plants and rocks and so forth. And so now, instead of walking aimlessly, we're actually walking in a direction, and we have a general sense, though we can't focus primarily on something yet. As we're walking, though, the relaxation of the brain, understanding the dynamic and filling in the data that it is supposed to be experienced, allows the two parties, Mr. Musk and I, to now focus our attention on talking to each other and keeping each other company. As we walk, though, fear begins to permeate one of our senses, and let's say that Mr. Musk has a fear of animals. A scorpion or a snake enters his mind. So what does he immediately do? He immediately tenses up and then changes the way he's walking and makes it known to me, who's not afraid of those things and not aware of it, until I see the change in the behavior of my friend here. So suddenly I turn to Mr. Musk and I say, "What, are you all right? What's going on?" And noticing the differential. And he looks at me and he goes, "Well, I just thought of something like, what if there's scorpions and snakes out here?" Now, as he says that, suddenly I feel something pass across my shoe. And I say, "Oh, I just felt something, I think, pass by me." And immediately, Mr. Musk then yells and screams in pain and says that he just got bitten by something and he thinks it was a snake. The question then being, without the light source, and with us not being able to focus our attention, was the fear of the snake what drove the snake towards us? Because remember, in the experience, in the simulation, the snake went over my foot and immediately went for who? The person who conjured the snake. So the question then becomes to the collective, was the snake actually ever there? Or did we manifest the snake because Mr. Musk was afraid of it? Hence the Garden of Shadows. The theory of the Garden of Shadows in a simulated experience is that we as souls are here to learn, and in a great academy, whether you're spiritual or scientific, one of the things that we're finding is the greatest mystery is the unknown. And one of the things that we're finding specifically in spiritual circles is the idea of manifestation, where you put out enough positive energy that you attract the same positive energy back to you and your life improves. But on the flip side of that, in polarity, a scientific term, we realize that if that's true, then we can also put out negative energy and attract negative results. So, going back to the walking in the desert, which is of course a metaphor for all of our experience, we start to question if what we are attracting or what we are creating as a collective is based on fear and fear alone, and that being the direct nature of the academy itself. Is the simulation a crash course in overcoming fears? And so as we would be going through the desert, the obvious philosophical question is, would this snake have even been a factor if, one, we would have been able to see clearly? Probably not, because the eye would have I didn't have to make assumptions. There would be no place for fear. It would just be seen, quote unquote. But in a situation where we're in a desert like Moses was, and we're walking aimlessly trying to find our way home, we would encounter all sorts of obstacles. But would the obstacles be there if our brain and our soul was not trying to overcome a fear? Would the snake have actually been there and attacked Mr. Musk in this scenario if he had not been afraid of it? So the reason I bring this up is because one of the greatest things that we as a collective are facing right now, and the reason I love Mr. Musk so much, why I love him so much, is because of the fact that he and other brilliant minds like him are now at a place where we're starting to realize that in this Garden of Shadows, in this Garden of Eden, on the bottom, on the material side, the physical world, is a reflective part the shadow nature of something above us, right? In spiritual terms, it's referred to as above, so below. So let's say that in the same scenario, we then look at the original story where we're in the street and it's at night. What is the one thing that always follows every individual whenever there is light of any source, even though whatever the environment being? What is it that it casts against the body? It casts a shadow. So if we understand the as above, so below principle, then wouldn't it stand to reason that there is something that we are not able to see in general daylight that is a heaven, if you will, or a middle ground between the sun, planet Earth, and then something in between, like the soul sphere, the fourth, fifth, sixth dimension? And wouldn't it then stand to reason that if we cast the shadow in jet black, that maybe the soul casts a shadow in color, hence the term human, the addition of a hue, a color, to the man energy. So, is it possible that because of the way that we operate and the lens, the goggles that we each have been given in our world, what we experience on day-to-day activity, that it is preventing us from seeing our soul's truest nature right directly above us, or somewhere between the sun and us? Possibly the moon. And so what would that information do for the collective, and how would that change how we as a species alter the course of our trajectory, and would that prevent us from making bigger and bigger mistakes? When we find ourselves in simulated experiences or in life in general, we tend to react to things, which is one of the reasons why the ascension theory, that we as souls are trying to rise above the chaos, is so important at this time. The question that brings to mind for the leaders that I'm speaking to, turquoise leaders or people involved or wanting to be involved in this type of topic in a show dynamic or in just a general middle ground point between religion and politics, would find the subject matter of most interest because of the fact that we're trying to do things that we ourselves have not mastered in our own world. If we live in a garden of shadow, then wouldn't it stand to reason that before we're able to go off planet to another snow globe, if you will, we would have to conquer our own fears down here? And that possibly what we're experiencing right now in the 3D, as the 5D merges and these two timelines come colliding into our matrix, is that we are at the point where we will be granted the secret knowledge or the missing pieces to the puzzle that will allow us to move off of Earth. For a very long time, I sat behind a very stern principle that I refused to go off planet until we started to take care of Earth and the great academy that we are, because I had this innate intuitive feeling or intuition that we would not be able, or we would not be permitted to leave the planet unless we started to take care of it, because I understood that the fear that we were experiencing here would be a driving force for a lot of people who should not be leaving to leave, and so they would be escaping the game almost like an escape room in a simulated experience. So suddenly, as I was working that out on my own, in my own way, I came across the ascension theory, which is the souls, the 5D and the 3D, are now merging in the 4D, the matrix, and that because of that, we as a species are now at a point where we must overcome our fears. And how did that start to play out? Well, immediately after that, the collective started to experience the P word, and it started to circle around us a bit like a shark. And what happened? Fear-mongering, fear tactics, and results of fear, of being afraid, started to make us go against our own moral fiber, and it started to change the dynamic of our species. So the question I have for you all is, are we manifesting the destiny that is our end, or are we now at a place as a peer group of leaders, as brilliant minds, are we at a state now where we can honestly see that what we are experiencing is a projected experience in a virtual reality or simulated experience? And is that why we are being told to awaken and to look at the world beyond what we see and feel into it what is actually beyond that? Because the truth of truths is that in order for us to go and experience the unknown, we haven't even finished feeling out the unknown of our own sphere. A lot of us are afraid of dogs, and it's the same principle as the snake theory. I have been around dogs that are vicious, and they never attack me. In fact, they come and they play with me and stuff like that. But immediately when someone is with me that is afraid of dogs, the dog will do what? It will bite that person. So in our experience, as we attempt to move on, and the reason I'm focusing my attention at the moment to Mr. Musk, is when we are thinking about moving off of Earth, then wouldn't it stand to reason that we would have to spend a lot of time being careful on psychological profiling of those that are going to be leaving Earth? Because if they are afraid of any part of the journey, whether it is getting on a vessel and the takeoff, or whether it's actually leaving our orbit, or whether it's what can happen in cabin pressure, or what can happen in cabin fever, or what will happen if, because many of them will not be returning, and are they really ready? All of those have fear attached to it. So wouldn't that then stand to reason in a simulated experience and in life, as we've just stated, that if they're afraid, then it could cost the rest of the team because of the fact that it would manifest because of their fear alone. And the reason I bring that up is because of the fact that if I would have been walking in the desert alone, like I have been my whole life, I have come to a place where I'm fearless. But because in the example I gave, I was with Mr. Musk and he was afraid of snakes in this scenario, my life became jeopardized, but it still attacked him. So the theory is, in the simulated experience, are we then now at this reset where we see the physical changes going on to our environment and to our experience? Does that now mean that there are a group of us that are being pulled together as soul tribes, or whatever you want to call it, who are more prone to being fearless instead of being fearful? And is that the great divide that is happening within our demographic and within our society? So when we think of things like this, let's focus the attention back on what the eye sees and what we can learn from the two examples that I've given. So from the first example, we're walking down a dark street, kind of like in life. We don't know where we're going. It's a lot of guessing until we see the light source. Now the light projects what we're supposed to see, but like we've noticed, two different people seeing the exact same image depicted in front of them will see and focus their eyes on two different things based on their own experiences. So in the same way, two individuals walking in the desert will experience the desert in different ways. For example, obviously me being fearless would look up at the night sky and be like, aren't those stars beautiful? And I probably wouldn't be paying attention to where I was walking. Whereas the other person in this scenario would be Mr. Musk, who is afraid of rattlesnakes or whatever, gets bit, and now I have the added bonus of trying to figure out how to carry him or suck the venom out of him, which is not a sexual innuendo because he's straight, but if he wasn't, maybe. But you see what I'm saying? So it changes the way that I am now experiencing the same thing. So the reason I bring it up for you all as a collective is as we start to realize that we are on a path where we're starting to meet and find like-minded people, we realize that it has to do with how we intend to experience the rest of our journey. And in particular, how we are going to encounter relationships, whether they are friendship or sexual. Because notice how rare it would be to be able to find another like-minded individual who sees the world through the same goggles as we do out of 7 billion people. And why it's called divine unions, because the great architect has been observing us and has now decided who energetically and vibrationally now matches each other, not because of anything that it wants from us, but because it knows that in order for the race to advance, these groupings or these individual couples will be needed to show the way and be the light in the darkest of times. How do we know? Because we're facing death. A lot of us are facing the death rebirth aspect. In spiritual terms, it's called being reborn. In scientific terms, it's called, what's it called when you circle back around? Reincarnation. Well, I guess that's still spiritual. But in terms of scientifically, it's the circle of life, right? And so as we encounter those things, one of the things that will be needed in the evolution is people, and individuals in particular, who are coupled, who use the same lens and have the same goggles from two different perspectives, though, but with the same understanding of what the simulation is about, in order to traverse the terrain and bring the people through it. Again, reflective of the Moses and of Jesus' story, where they had to go into uncharted territories, which once again played out again when we left England and came to the United States in order to free ourselves from religious persecution. And so as we go through this particular reset, as you can see, the basic focus that we are experiencing as a collective, as awakened individuals in this Garden of Shadows, is that we are now being matched up with people who are either see the world through the same lens and the same goggles, the same virtual reality goggles, or are being guided by something that we can't see because it's above our understanding. One of the things I noticed when I was thinking about this particular video that I was going to post for Mr. Musk was, have you ever noticed that in a snow globe, when you are looking at a planet, it is essentially a snow globe. It's a ball that contains a lot of life. It's almost like an arboretum, or not an arboretum, but like some sort of anthill. And you notice that there's usually like a queen ant and so forth. What if we are now facing, as a collective, a requeening of the hive, essentially, and that what we're trying to do now is do what they called for the Wreck-It Ralph scenario, where we are now facing the opportunity, or the obstacle, depending on where you're at in awakened state, of going from one globe to another globe. And here's what I say, or what I'm meaning. When we think in scientific terms, we realize that there's a sphere around us, the atmosphere that protects us from the rays of the sunlight. Now, interestingly, is that the only thing it does, or does it provide a solid white backdrop, a blank canvas from which the sun is able to project the environment that we are seeing in the virtual reality? And how would that work? Because it reaches our eye lens, the color, the eye lens that we have, and it alters what we are seeing. How do we know? Because intuition has more often than not saved our asses from doing stupid shit. For example, there are cars that are operated by those machines, Surrey or whatnot, and occasionally we hear the story of how they told them to turn left, and what did they do? They ended up in a river, or dead, or whatnot. Now, before that happened, we as animals, as hybrids, whatever you want to call us, would stand to understand that their intuition must have warned them that that was not the right direction. After all, they were able to see that they couldn't see the path before them. But what did they do? They allowed the fear of making the wrong choice disregard that and override them and drive them right into chaos. The same can be said for what we as a collective are experiencing now through the fear tactics. So the idea here being that if we are in a simulation, that those of us who are awakened, truly awakened, are now facing the fact that we're not just doing a single mastery. It's now about what we are willing to encounter and how we're willing to do it, because we're starting to see why the sun is called a mirror ball by those of us who are enlightened. And those of you who have never heard of that term will now understand why that's called a mirror ball. Because it has to do with what we take in and what our experience has taught us it means in what's being projected around us. So next time someone asks you if it's possible that we are in a simulated experience, or even better, that we are a hybrid model, animal breed of some kind that has been altered, the question or the answer should be possibly. Because as we can see, what we take into our eye is not always what is actually in front of us. And the better question is the unknown worth the risk? Because as we saw in the desert example, Mr. Musk may have actually created the snake. The snake probably wouldn't have been there had Mr. Musk not been afraid of the snake. So in that understanding, we realize that the simulation that is changing isn't as bad as we thought. It's indicative of the fact that enough of us awakened beings are altering the way that we perceive it as a collective, because we have learned that what we see is not always what's there. And that's where the fun part begins for those of us at this time. So in a simulated theory, one of the things that I discovered is that there's a polarity to the way that we observe the universe. And the reason being that we still haven't mastered the physical world yet, because we're still overcoming fears. But those of us who are being part of a divine union of whatever kind are finding ourselves now focusing our attention on specific people who view the world and interpret their surroundings in the same way, forming soul tribes. Because we're about to change the dynamic, because the universe is changing its directive towards us. It's about to do a reset. We can tell because of the way that things are shaking up. So, in that understanding, what we're starting to realize is that some of the partnerships are odd couples. There's a strange dynamic playing out because the simulation is now just turning more to strategy. So, let's say Mr. Musk, who do share the idea that this is a simulated experience, get partnered up as friends, and we begin to venture down into creative avenues that bring you all into the conversation. Both of us probably are at a point in our lives right now where we have done very well for ourselves, me spiritually and him in his own right. And we're trying now to do something different. We're being called forward to do something greater. Something that is a teachable moment, that is an ongoing creation cycle that helps the universe expand. One of the things that he and I would have in common is that we are fearless. We do not fear death. We probably both look at the world in a very big query and always fascinated by the oddity of things. And so that would make sense. Now, the way that it was brought to my attention was that I was the Angela to him being the Temperance from Bones, if you guys have ever seen that show, and that the different vantage points unlock the key to the other, meaning that because our perspective and the way that we accept what we see and what we feel, him probably seeing it more in a matrix, numerical values type of way, and seeing it for what it is in that context, in an analytical way. I would interpret the exact same experience in a very emotional, intuitive nature, both being absolutely right, but both needing the other, in this example, for the simulation to progress. Okay. So what I mean by that is, have you ever noticed that sometimes I come across as Penny from The Big Bang Theory? I surround myself with very, very brilliant minds, but I come at it from a standpoint of an everyday layman, right? I'm one of those people who is quite brilliant, but I also am an airhead from time to time, and I used to find that to be my flaw, until I realized that it's my greatest strength, because I will ask questions that are so simple sometimes that it will trigger the brilliant minds around me to deduce something that was not seen before, because they overcomplicated the same thing. They get stuck in their head. I get stuck in my emotions. The two mixed together, brilliance, right? It changes the world. It's where visionaries' innovation comes from. And I'll give you a perfect example. One day I was talking to a brilliant friend of mine who's a big old introvert, right? And he's one of the few people that I honestly really enjoy talking to, because we extrapolate about a bunch of stuff. And he's one of the reasons I'm so attracted to Elon Musk in this way, and why I have such a big crush on Anderson Cooper too, but that's a whole different ballgame. One's very sexual, one could be, but he's straight, so there's no point, but I'm getting on a digression. The moral of the story is, we were talking, and he was talking to me about the exploration of space, and we were discussing my concern and what I've been channeled and what I get from something higher about the need for us to prioritize spirituality into the conversation, because I feel personally, as a simulated experience, that we undervalue that from the scientific standpoint, and that the spiritual community undervalues science, and that there is a polarity there that needs to dissipate in order for us to make the right progress. Because I noted that my brain was very clear on what would happen. Let's say that you send a group of 5 people into space. Well, we would need to make sure that we cross-section the psychological profile, because psychology technically is a pseudoscience for the moment. I still think it has a lot of room to grow, but I'm just going to say it's a pseudoscience, in the same way that people look at spirituality as a pseudoscience. And so what would happen is, if you neglected one over the other, then yes, psychologically speaking, they would probably be okay in the mechanical, analytical standpoint. But when it comes to the isolation, and it comes to their feeling about life and how that would really fuck up the wrong type of brain, it would really screw things up for the whole group, because it would lead to depression, it would lead to suicidal thoughts. They wouldn't, if they didn't have a partner, it would be it. They would have nothing to rely on. And so if they were not spiritually sound, they would be morally poor. And so if you have a spiritual poorness in a very, very tense situation where they cannot escape it, and there's an environment where, let's say, they go to Mars, then imagine how easy it would be for them to snap under the pressure and become their greatest fear, right? Because that's all they would focus on, is what they're missing. They wouldn't have the spiritual sovereignty to walk forward knowing that there's nothing to fear. For them, their brain would populate it with whatever their psychological downfalls are, their Achilles heels. And so we were speaking of this, and suddenly he turned the conversation to the idea of the black hole and how that might be a concern in space exploration. And I said, well, I don't understand why people haven't noticed this yet, but in polarity, in the existence of the universe, it would stand to reason to me, as the penny figure, that if there's suns here in our galaxy, then the opposite of that would be the black hole. The sun creates life, it beams it down and projects all of this beauty into our universe, and it gives us what we perceive through the oculus part, right? But the black hole is the complete opposite. It destroys everything and breaks it down and rebuilds it. So one creates life from when it's born, and one breaks it down in death, and so it's the life and death cycle. Interestingly, my theory that I've always hypothesized is this, that the sun is a sun here, but in another dimension would be what? A black hole. It would be its opposing side. It would be the inner core of the sun, only from the perspective of the opposite side. And I floored my friend, and he said, I never thought of it that way. And I said, well, that's why I'm here. And so when we're talking about stuff like this question that begs is, in the simulated theory that we're now all exploring, the multiple dimensions becomes a factor in how we would explore things. And there are things called time ribbons and all of this other stuff that we all think is just fantasy. But if we understand that we are living in a simulated experience, then is it really a fantasy, or is it part of the illusion that we must calculate into the equation? We have for so long, and this is why I'm a spiritual person, have believed that science is the only way to do these things and to make these calculations. But one of the things we keep running into is a proverbial wall. We're not making the evolutionary jump because we're missing one of the biggest pieces. It takes a brilliant mind in a different perspective from a different walk of life to look at the exact same scenario and point out something that no one else in that group would see. Hence why we're so focused in the simulation now to bringing the science and spiritual sense together and creating the infinity. Now, the reason I bring this all up and I focus all my attention on Mr. Musk on this is because I don't have anybody to talk to about this stuff. And so you all in the collective are watching why it's so important, in my opinion, for me to live my soul's purpose, which is to teach and to talk about stuff like this, because it expands your ability to perceive the world in a different way, and it allows us as a race to make the jump needed at this time. This is about teamwork, about partnership, about a collective consciousness, something unseen, something that lives in a dimension and in a different reality than ours. But as we've just explored, reality is subjective and based on the key players who are being pulled together. You see, to me, going to space, which I'm going to get to in a minute why this came up, but to me, going to space is I would be like, sure, why not? And it was a what the fuck moment earlier today because my guides randomly said to me, okay, well, if you ever met Mr. Musk and he offered you to go to space, would you go to Mars? And I was like, what the fuck, where's this coming from? I haven't even, I haven't fallen in love or anything. And all of a sudden I went, and the what the fuck moment was, no, I would have no problem with that. I think that'd be fun. I don't know how that would work out. I'm 40, I'll be 43 on July 1st, but I don't know if they would be done in time for me to go without, without there being any health concerns. But I mean, it's a one-way trip. If I had a husband and we went together, I think that would be fun. It would be like a honeymoon that never ended. And I started to, it opened my creative process because I was willing to go into the unknown, and I was going for the right reasons, for exploration, and I understood that I wouldn't be coming back, and I took all of that, and I didn't have a psychological or spiritual reaction because of the journey I've already been on this whole year and a half of the past. You know, God sent me on a spiritual mission and up the mountain to really, really look at things so that I can bring subject matter like this to you all, which is why the show I'm trying to get on and all that stuff. But it has to do with the intellectual dialogue that we need to be having with each other if we're going to make this jump. And so the perfect example was given to me this morning as I was getting ready to go for a hike, because I went to Griffith Observatory. I mean, hello, we're talking about space. And it was one of the things that we can explore while we're here that will help us understand the cosmos is to explore the deeper parts of the oceans, because like air is to us to breathe, water is the same to fish. And the way that this came about is, have you ever noticed that a hummingbird is the equivalent in our physical land reality to the seahorse in the ocean? And that there is a multiple dimensions that exist within our own cosmos. For example, I use the anthill. If we stand from a high enough perspective, looking down on whatever the light is showing us below, we see everything in terms of an anthill or a beehive. Whereas if we're on the ground, then our dimension would show us as being human, right? But to something much higher than us, we would not be. So it's a perspective jump. But what it was is the fact that if we understand that there is polarity in all ways, then where there's water, it would be the equivalent to air in this scenario, right? Fish don't know what water is. They don't understand that it's water. They just know that that's in our environment. The same way that we assume air is the only thing breathable, but it's the complete same thing as water would be. And so in that context, we begin to open the creative process, and we begin to help the universe expand, which I'm willing to bet helps us in the simulation advance to what's next. I leave that question to you all, though, because it takes the ability to go into the unknown, something that we do not like doing. We're so comfortable with this make-believe reality simulation that we don't question things because we're told not to. But as you can see, just in the little almost 45 minutes that I've been talking, you now have gained different perspectives of the same situations, and it makes sense to you. Hence why my soul is here. It's one of the things I do, is that I break down really super intelligent dialogue and I put it in a way that we all can understand, because I'm also willing to be the idiot who goes, well, isn't the sun just the black hole in reverse? And though it sounds exceedingly stupid to some people, to some of the most brilliant minds, it floors them because they never would have thought of it that way. But it is the polarity point between it. Where there's a sun, there should be a black hole, because the one it creates is what takes care of all life once it's actually triggered, once it's actually an active virtual aspect. Once it has its goggles, then it becomes something prone to light, and it's what helps you project what you're experiencing. Hence why people always tell you in spiritual circles, you are the manifester of your own destiny, is because it's what you're willing to invest your attention on, right? Hence the same thing that happened with Mr. Musk and me in the desert. If we are, as a collective, afraid of the unknown, then the unknown bites us. But if you find a pool of people who are fearless about the unknown and willing to go on an adventure, then the universe opens itself up to us, because those people will look at every aspect of the scenario and ensure that everything has been thought of from at least 10 different perspectives, and each of them will have been brought together by something that we don't see. And that is a great mystery that we are still trying to find. So, if we as a collective, as a scientific or spiritual community, are willing to make the jump that's needed at this time, then obviously the best thing we can do is face our fears head on, help each other, hence the show and what I'm trying to do with us as a peer group of leaders, and pull the information together in a way that enlightens everyone equally, providing light disbursement across all shadows, in order to allow the universe to be willing to show us what's been in plain sight this entire time. Again, taking the fact that we are in the garden of shadows in spiritual terms, it stands to reason that we are the shadow of something. something that probably you might resemble or understand if you would just bother to tip your laptop up at an angle and look at what it looks like to be a two-dimensional image. If you'll notice, it's a dance between light and dark. There's no hue, right? Going back to the theory of the simulation. The first dimension being light itself, the second dimension being the shadow, sunlight mixing together, third dimension being the hue, color, part of the rainbow, disbursement in enlightenment circles. Fourth dimension is the matrix it creates and the dynamic between all the senses. And the fifth dimension would be the spiritual presence of something that we're just beginning to understand. Hence, the Garden of Shadows. That's it for me, guys, for this particular video. I hope, Mr. Musk, you see this and you find it of interest, because I would love to pick your brain. For the rest of you out there, I hope that this made sense. Make sure that you like, share, and subscribe if you did find it of interest. And understand, investors and others out there, this is something that is quite fascinating to a lot of people. We see that there's more to what the illusion is telling us, because we can already see through the facade and the lies. So what is the evolutionary jump? And if it is for us to tap into a collective consciousness, then it's going to have to be the right people in the mix being brought together that will allow, that the universe will allow that access to. Just food for thought. That's it for me, guys. Have a great night.